Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Kingdom of Dreams podcast and Making of Stories. I'm your host, Jawad Mir. Today has something a little different, not film related, but definitely story related. A story of a very resilient woman, a doctor, an oncologist, Dr. Azra Raza, who is a poet, who has gone through some incredible tough times and is out on a journey to find cure for cancer. Her story is very personal, a lot of things that she went through life, which I won't talk about. I'll let the conversation unfold. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Azra Raza. Well, let's talk about poetry. What got you into poetry, Urdu poetry?
I think initially because the way I grew up in Pakistan, my parents who had migrated from Lucknow, my father from Lucknow, my mother from Aligarh, and they landed in Pakistan in 1947, 14th of August. And they were seeped in that culture where poetry is not something that belongs to bookshelves in libraries, but it is a part of your every conversation, your table talk. Everything is informed by some great classical poet giving their verdict on whatever is under discussion. And so growing up in that atmosphere, and secondly, my parents suffered from an immigrant's anxiety, I suspect, because they were so kind of stunned by having come from hundreds of years of a courtesy culture and landing into the desert of Sindh, which had its own culture. I'm not saying they didn't, but it was just foreign to them. And they didn't know what to make of it. And they were very anxious to pass on some of their age old, as I said, courtesy culture, tehzeeb to their children. And I think we, the children, benefited from it because part of that tradition is an oral tradition. So you memorize tons of poetry and then you learn to use it appropriately at the right time, because what a poet can say in 25 words or less can really contain macrocosms of meaning. And so I was made to memorize hundreds of verses since I could speak. And that at one point was simply being able to recite them back and get some applause for it in little family gatherings. But once you grow up and start to understand a little meaning of Ghalib and Anis and Josh and Mir, then you have no choice, Jawad, but to look deeper into it. That's what happened to me.
Was there a particular poem or a verse that sticks out more from your early years that sort of defines who you are today in a way? And because it has such deep meanings, right? Poetry, like something that you can connect to instantaneously. Like I know for me, there's a couple of songs written by Javed Akhtar that I can think about in an instant that kind of drew me there. And not to your level, but if that's something that you can remember, I would love to hear that.
I would say that not poetry that I grew up with, but with life. I have dedicated my entire life to trying to cure cancer, Jawad, and I haven't. So when I think about my life and see the sea of disappointments and lost opportunities and vanishing options and what I haven't been able to do for my patients, there is a couple of couplets that I think could summarize my whole life. And it's by contemporary poet Sheheryad. जुस्तुजू जिसकी थी उसको तो न पाया हमने. What I was striving for, I did not achieve. For me, it was cancer. जुस्तुजू जिसकी थी उसको तो न पाया हमने. इस बहाने से मगर देख ली दुनिया हमने. But in that walk, in that journey, I saw the whole world. I experienced a universe. And the second share is even more evocative for me because it's exactly why someone like me, who hasn't attained what I set out to attain and yet continues to go on. Tujhko ruswa na kiya. I didn't begin to question my goal and start insulting you. तुझको रुसवा न किया, खुद भी पशेमा न हुए. Nor did I question my own dedication, my own devotion, how much I had put into this. Such a beautiful line.
Yeah.
तुझको रुसवा न किया. So begin with जुस्तुजू जिसकी थी उसको तो न पाया हमने, इस बहाने से मगर देख ली दुनिया हमने. तुझको रुसवा न किया, खुद भी पशेमा न हुए. इश्क की रस्म को इस तरह निभाया हमने. Love and passion and your object of desire demands a certain level of unconditional devotion. You should not expect anything back from it, and you must continue, because if you don't, then if you are expecting things back in return, if you are expecting success, then that moment of gratification you're fighting for becomes useless. In other words, it's the journey that matters, and the Buddhists have said it thousands of years ago that the Zen you find on top of the mountain is the Zen you brought with yourself. It's that journey that matters, not that mountaintop.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have had mostly people on this podcast talk about movies, right? Um, but one of the things that I keep saying to a lot of people on the podcast, but I've also always believed for the last good over a decade, is that having a purpose, and when you have a purpose, you'll have passion for that purpose. And when you have passion and love for that purpose, you will produce results, whether it's changing the world or changing one person in the world. And that itself is the biggest success you can have. Because when you start expecting, money, which is fine, I understand that's how the money goes, girl. You need money to move around the world. But that gratification, you don't remember how much money you made 20 years ago. You remember the life experiences and the memories that you still have them with
Well
you.
said.
And that's what matters the most.
Well said. I'd add one thing, one more thing to it. I couldn't agree more with you, Jawad, and someone young like you having these insights. It's wonderful. I just said one more thing, that the other moment of gratification in this journey is the insights you develop in your own self through these experiences, through the journey.
100%. It's so true. And in life, there's poetry, and then obviously the verses that you read about struggle and discovering yourself and gratitude and all that. What if you, well, obviously your book, which is about cancer and how your husband was uh, passed away due to leukemia. If we can, and I don't want to bring you back into down the memory lane in a deep and emotional way, but if you're comfortable sharing the beginning of that journey of when it all started with your husband and what
Mhm.
you had to go through to be able to be where you are today.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a great job by starting with poetry, because it put us in that kind of a mood where we can talk about cancer not through the prism of facts and statistics and all the horrors,
Of course,
but rather from the anguish that, from the prism of human anguish, of what the patient
please.
is going through, what the family is going through. And that is the title of my book, The First Cell and the Human Costs of Pursuing Cancer to the Last. That is what basically compelled me to write the book eventually after so many years of practicing oncology, is because the human cost is becoming worse and worse with time, with less and less benefit to the patients. And it is something that takes me back to where I started in the journey as a teenager. I read about cancer. I discover that within our body, we give birth to a cell that can live forever. And then, not only that, cells are supposed to follow rules. Cancer cells don't follow rules. For example, one rule is that if you're born in the liver as a cell, you stay a liver cell. If you're born in the pancreas, you stay in the pancreas. But in one condition, cancer, they walk out of their organs of origin. A lung cancer ends up in the brain, and ovarian cancer ends up in the liver. Why? So it was an intellectual fascination to begin with about asking these two questions. How does a cancer cell become immortal, live forever? Because once we can unlock that secret, we could unlock the secret of aging, I figured. And secondly, the fact that it requires mobility. So here's a cell that in one giant leap can do both things, become immortal and become mobile. How is that happening? So this was the intellectual fascination. But because in Pakistan, where I was growing up, there were no PhD programs available in molecular biology, things I wanted to do. So in my only entry into science was through medical school. And entering med school as a third year student, I then met my second love, which is I saw the first cancer patient. And the grotesque nature of that disease was so horrifying to me that it became instantly apparent that, yes, questioning and being curious about scientific issues that I had been thinking about is one thing, but now the rest of my life has to be devoted to trying to reduce the suffering of cancer patients. And so, when you combine an emotional kind of investment with the intellectual obsession that you already had, that's what becomes a quest. And for me, curing cancer became a quest. And I'm not afraid to say the word curing cancer because a lot of people don't even talk about cure. They're just improving survival, improving this, that. I mean, that's for me, it's always been about that ultimate answer and a compassionate, patient centric answer.
Hmm. And now you have this obsession that's attached to your intellectual sense, and you're on this journey. How old were you, if you don't mind me asking, back then when you realized this? This is in the 80s or
Well, I was
90s?
a teenager when I started my
Okay.
intellectual interest in cancer, and still a teenager when I started med school, but and met my first patient. But the obsession kept growing, Jawad, and I mean, those were my two platonic loves. I was in love with the idea of solving a mystery. And then the third love that happened to me was actual flesh and blood love. I fell in love with a man, and and that can also kill if it remains unrequited, just like cancer. It's as bad if you really fall in love.
Mm.
But fortunately, mine ended happily, and I did get married, and we had a wonderful life. And then all three of these things that were basically my three obsessions got kind of chaotically and um, in a complexity when Harvey, my husband, developed cancer himself. And even though I had been taking care of cancer patients for 20 years, even then I had not realized how painful a disease it can be until I shared a bed with a cancer patient. Our daughter was only 4 years old. So it was a very difficult time for me to be a mother of a young child and an oncologist to my own husband. And of course, after a practically 5 year long battle, he died. And the issue was that he had already had one solid cancer when he was 34. And at 57, he gets a second one and dies. The second cancer is a leukemia unrelated. And this is precisely the question I had been asking myself, that why are patients who get one cancer more prone to developing a second cancer? Do you know that 20% of all new cases that are diagnosed, 20%, one in five, are diagnosed in a cancer survivor? It's not like it's a relapse or recurrence of their disease. It is a new cancer. Like my husband had a solid cancer, then he develops a leukemia. 20 years, 25 years later. So the questions were, and I had been spending my life trying to find a cure for cancer, which became very apparent to me is not going to come from treatment. Because you see, Jawad, the problem is that a cancer happens in one cell. As soon as that cell divides into two, those two cells are not exactly alike. Because the DNA polymerase can make copying errors of the DNA. So there can be a few new mutations in one and the same old ones in the second. So those kinds of things, and then each of those will divide into two. So the complexity keeps increasing. And by the time we diagnose cancer, it has gone through 1 million of such divisions already.
Mm.
So think of the minor changes that are occurring. So it's not cancer is not just one disease that you're treating anymore. It's thousands of these multiple cells and their little populations, these subclones of them. So the complexity is such that cancer will always be a step ahead of our treatment strategies unless we can cut them out, like solid
Mm.
tumors. If you cut them out, you cure it. But
Right.
so the idea was the only good news we give our cancer patients is, hey, we found it early, so we can cure. And
Yeah.
that meant that if you take this to its logical extension, is that shouldn't you be working to find cancer as early as possible? In other words, don't wait for cancer to find you. You go and find cancer before it finds you. So, how do you do that? And I'm so glad you have me on this podcast because most recently, after a 10-year collaboration, our biomedical engineers at Columbia have come up with the solution. I've been working with them, and I want to show you the solution.
Sure.
This is the cure for cancer. And
Mm.
what I'm holding is a syringe and a needle. The cure is not in the syringe, there's no drug in there. The cure is in the needle. What could be in the needle? In the needle is a stent, like a coronary stent that
Mm-hmm.
millions of people are walking around with. That's exactly what this is, a stent, except it has been fabricated with some electronic circuitry and a little chip has been built into the stent. And this stent can be put into an arm vein here. And by producing an electrical current in the blood vessel where it's inserted, it can detect every cell that is passing through it and record it on the chip that is built into the stent and send that information to a cloud above your head. And that information, imagine millions and millions of cells are passing per second through the stent. And depending upon the size of the cell, each will create a signal because the cell, as it's going through the electrical current, will cause impedance of the current. And if the cell is small, the signal will be small. If the cell is large, signal will be large. And the first cancer cell is a very large cell, we think. So as it's going through, it can be detected. Not only detected, the stent can be programmed to electrocute it on the spot. So you see, this stent can screen the entire 5 liters of blood in our body every 18 days continuously from birth to death. This is the kind of solution that I've been working towards for all my life. And finally, I see the light at the end of the tunnel. And this is the work of two brilliant biomedical engineers, Sam Sia and Ken Shepard at Columbia University. I've been working with them for many years because they are building this stent. Over $50 million of grant monies have gone into building this stent and 10 years of work. These things don't happen overnight, right?
Right.
So this is worth $50 million, this little thing in the needle. But the point is, they have the stent. What should they detect in it? And that's where I come in, that I have been saving samples of blood and marrow and biopsies and saliva on my patients since 1984 to now. And I have the largest tissue repository in the world on this kind of disease. 60,000 samples on thousands of patients longitudinally obtained. So, from pre leukemia to acute leukemia. So, you can trace the cells back all the way to the first start of the thing. And that's where I come in, that through the stent, what do you detect? Well, you detect the things that I'm going to be showing that this is what you need to detect. So, it's such a wonderful collaboration because in the end science art can be I. You can I don't know about film, it's also not I, but art, in terms of a painting, Van Gogh could stand and paint the Starry Night by
Yeah.
himself. But science is we have to work together from different disciplines, and I think film is a good example. You are a filmmaker, you can't make a film by yourself. You need
Mm-mm.
like teams and teams of people with different areas of expertise and bringing them together and all that. So imagine doing just that for trying to cure cancer. We have to have AI experts who are coming up with all the analytics by which this petabytes of data have to be continuously analyzed. And then, as the first giant cells are detected, send warning signals to basically your cell phone that, hey, there's something going on here. We have to alert you. But imagine the number of disciplines that have to work together to bring this kind of thing to the bedside.
100%. No, thank you for sharing such a valuable insight. I wanted to go back to your, and I will come back to this. You know, you had this obsession about curing cancer long before you met your husband or long before you even had cancer. And do you feel that, and I'm trying to ask something personal, so if it's too much, please feel free to not answer. Do you feel that you were being prepared by the universe or God or whatever anybody believes in to be able to deal with that later in your life? And second part of that question is, when you did find out your husband had cancer and then he passed away, at any point or even now, do you sometimes say, you know what, I wish I had found the cure before something happened to him?
I would have been hesitant to answer personal questions until 6 years ago when I wrote my book, because I had never spoken about Harvey, his illness, whatever. But then when I started writing the stories of my patients in such granular detail, I felt it was insincere to hold back on mine, as if mine was worth protecting and keeping
Mm-hmm.
private, but theirs is not. And that's what forced me to then come out and start writing about Harvey. But if you've read the book, you'll notice then that becomes like a red line going through every chapter, because
Mm-hmm.
that is my personal journey then. So nothing in this universe had prepared me for what happened. Nothing. I must say it was a dread always, because he had had a cancer at 34 years of age, and it took many years for him to get over that fact that, okay, now I've survived, I can have a proper life, etc. And just about the time when he was being lulled into a complacency, the second cancer hit. And already in that time, I had been studying and trying to collect samples on people who had had one cancer in order to find the first cell of the second cancer. In other words, I was already studying cancer survivors. And you asked me whether after Harvey died, would I have I thought about, I wish I had found this earlier. And this is what I was working for. If I had found it earlier, then he would never have died of the second cancer. So it is precisely what is on my 3 a.m. agenda all the time, that how I failed him.
I wouldn't say you failed him, but it is a tough thing. So I know somebody who went through that, and it's something that you do. feel responsible for, but at the end of the day, you're not, right? And at least it's not like you've given up on this trek. If anything, again, I'm maybe I'm being a little too philosophical, is that maybe this journey of yours that you're on, maybe you wouldn't have found this solution had that not happened, God forbid, right? So again, I'm not being saying that's how it is. I'm just kind of playing at a higher level, just trying to figure it out. But at the end of the day, it's motivated you more. But what I would love to know, and again, I'm going at a personal place, what was your husband like? Forget cancer, forget everything else, as a human being and your relationship with him, and what made how did he make you laugh, and just trying to sort of an ode to him in this little part of the question.
um, my advice to my daughter is always never marry someone you can live with. Only marry someone you can't live without. There's a big difference between the two. If you can just live with someone, but then the problem of marriage is that it's such an intimate relationship that unless you're illogically obsessed by the person, everything they do will start annoying the hell out of you. So asking me is the wrong person to ask because I was blinded and hard for me to say. But I mean, he was the head of the cancer center. He was my mentor. He was the greatest oncologist I met, and he taught me everything in oncology that I knew. So I have to say, I greatly admired him intellectually as well. But despite his amazing strengths that as a man he had, and for example, when he had cancer and was going through such a tormented time, that if I would ever cry about it, he would protect me and console me and say, look, it's the luck of the draw. Don't worry about what I'm going through. We have to take care of our little child. And the one thing he always said was, look, I don't expect any good ending for this. There is no hope for me. I am going to die. But I am a man, and a man is responsible for himself. And the stoicism and the poise with which he showed and endured all the tortures that were visited upon him is exactly the nobility that we should all be seeking. And yet, this man was so sensitive that our daughter, Sheherzad, had severe asthma. So, once as a very little child, we had ended up in the emergency room and she barely could breathe, and we were giving her nebulizer treatment after treatment and just walking back and forth all night with her in our arms, taking turns. Finally, at like 5 a.m., she started to breathe a little better and went to sleep. And as soon as she did, Harvey said, come out with me for a second. We went out into this early morning in Chicago, like 5 a.m. And you know what he said to me was so moving still to me. He said, if something happens to her, I'm going to kill myself. I said, well, that's great. What kind of solace is that or consolation is that supposed to bring me? He said, no. He said, no, you know why I'm saying that? Why I'll kill myself if something happens to her? He said, because if those fundamentalists are right and there is a life after death, then I don't want the little one to be alone.
Wow. Wow. That's I don't think I've heard anybody ever say that before. You always talk about afterlife and meeting your creator and all that, but never in that sense.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. How did you guys meet?
At work. I mean, That was it. I was 24 and I had arrived in the US, but they were 6 months before I could start my residency in medicine. I was so panicked, Jawad, that in these 6 months, somebody is going to cure cancer and I'll be left behind. So I showed up at Roswell Park Cancer Center in Buffalo, New York, and said, "Please take me and let make me do anything. I just have to be involved." So they started. They had a job, a fellowship available in pediatric oncology. So I started a fellowship before I did my residency in pediatric oncology. But 3 months later, they kicked me out. Not because I was stupid or anything, but because I was crying the whole time. And I was crying because I couldn't sit on little 2-year-olds and push bone marrow needles into them and draw spinal fluid from them and torture them with chemotherapy, and the amount of vomiting watching these little babies. It was just torture. So I was crying the whole time. And they said, "Look, you can't last here." And they pushed me into adult oncology. And that's where Harvey was the head of the leukemia service, and he was attending on the floor when I started. And that's how we started working together. But one thing I realized, Jawad, as soon as I went from pediatric oncology to adult oncology, something occurred to me immediately, that the very drugs we were using, 3, 4 drug combination, to cure a childhood leukemia had no effect in the adult leukemia. Now, the disease was not different, but the hosts bearing the disease were very different, because the rest of the body of a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old is literally virgin cells. Whereas a 70-year-old, every cell in that body has seen 1,000 cuts already. So the way the two cells in the two bodies metabolize the drugs we are giving them is totally different. So the same disease for which you have a cure in childhood,
You
nothing
don't
in
in
adult.
adult, yeah.
When that realization came to me, I realized something very clearly, that if even a childhood littler version of ourselves cannot serve as a model to study the adult disease, how can we use animals as models to study a human disease? How are we going to cure a mouse and then think that that drug will work in
Mm,
human when that doesn't work from childhood to adult? And that's
that's
when I
interesting.
became completely against creating any artificial models in vitro in the labs in animals to study cancer. And I said, we have to study humans. So, how do you study humans? Well, you need human cells. That's why back in 1984, as a very young person, I started banking samples and I've continued to do this all along, so that now I have the largest tissue repository of cells. And now, in the age of AI, what is needed? Data. AI needs data. AI needs human data, not animal data. Doesn't work, because 95% of experimental therapies we are developing today for cancer, today, 95% fail. And the 5% that succeed, in my opinion, should have failed, because they're not curing people, they're improving survival by months.
Mm.
So AI needs data, and very few people have access to that data. They've started collecting samples now, but I have that retrospective data, not just samples, but the clinical data that goes with it. Why did one person survive with a pre leukemia for 10 years before developing leukemia, and the other died within 6 months of leukemia? I have all those samples going backwards. So now AI needs me badly and my samples badly. So I am very hopeful that the kind of technology I just shared with you, the biomedical engineering feats of our engineers, Sam and Ken, combined with the kind of things that AI, miracles that it's creating. Can I give you one example of an AI
Please,
miracle?
please.
I always have Chat GPT open next to me in my computer. Whatever I'm doing, I am constantly assisted by that. The weird thing, Jawad, is that it learns about you. So it treats me like it has known me forever.
Yeah.
So let me give you one example. The other day, I put into a question ChatGPT and I said, look, I have a patient A and a patient B. They have the same disease. I gave them this treatment. It worked in patient A, it didn't work in patient B. Give me the reasons why. It gave me the reasons in a very beautiful, I mean, I've been thinking about those issues forever, so I knew most of them. It kept giving me the reasons in A, this happened, in B, that happened, etc. But then it's in the end it says, but Azra, wouldn't it have been the best approach instead of these treatments for both A and B who started with pre-leukemia and developed leukemia and one responded and one didn't? Wouldn't it have been great if you had put in your Sentinel in them? I was
Oh
so
wow.
shocked because we have never published this work. It has no way of knowing. The only way it knew is because I was applying for a grant for the Sentinel and I had put in the grant into AI to say, take out all the grammatical errors and,
Yeah.
I'm passing it through AI.
y-
And
Yeah.
it learned about the Sentinel. And
That's
five
crazy.
months later, 5 months later, it brings up the Sentinel to me and says, wouldn't it have been better? I mean, gave
That is
me,
crazy.
yeah.
No, it's true. I've noticed that too, not to that level, but if I asked, you know how you can start different chats, right, in ChatGPT, and if I mention a certain keyword that I had mentioned maybe a month ago, it will automatically pick up that I'm talking about that
Yes.
conversation, right?
Yeah, that's
But
exactly what it is.
that's fascinating. But yours is like another level. But what I would love again, I'm all for ears about the technical stuff, which I think is fantastic. But to me, as a storyteller, I'm always more about the human condition and the human stories. And I go back to that all the time. Your husband passes away, and you're left with a 5-year-old daughter or 4-year-old?
She was 4 when he was diagnosed and 8 something when he died,
8.
4.5 years later.
Does she remember seeing that? I mean, at 4 you're more conscious, I would imagine. And then seeing him through that pain, and then obviously at 8, I think you would know that you've lost, your father. Uh, what, again, it's a very cliche question to ask. I would just like for you to talk about that experience of how difficult was it to deal with all that for you and for her.
First, I want to tell you one background because
Please.
even before I became pregnant, long before, couple of years before that, I was sent the PhD thesis of somebody at Hopkins and in English literature. And I read it, and basically it was later published as a book, Woman's Body, Woman's Word by Fedwa Malti Douglas. And the hypothesis was that Sheherzad, who is the protagonist in 1001 Arabian Nights, is the first real feminist in the Arab world. And the idea was that, the story is, of course, well known. Prince Shahryar comes home from a hunt and finds his wife, the queen, committing adultery with the slave. He beheads them both, but his anger is not assuaged. So he's so angry at women in general, he gets one young girl picked up every night and he ravishes them and then beheads them in the morning. So hundreds of girls were losing their lives this way. And Sheherzad, who was the daughter of the vizier, conspires with her father and her sister Dunyazad to be picked up by Shahryar. And he ravishes her. And then in the morning, when he's about to behead her, she says, well, there's some time to the azan. Why don't I tell you a story? And he says, okay, tell me a story. So she starts telling the story, then lasts 1,001 nights. At the end of which he marries her. They have three kids already, etc., etc. So the whole story is very interesting in that Sheherzad depended upon her storytelling power to save the lives of her sisters. And after
Mm.
reading this, I said to Harvey, if I ever have a daughter, I'm going to name her Sheherzad and give her a purpose in life that she has to tell stories that will save the lives of her sisters and work for women's causes all over the world. And Harvey's response was, well, I can't imagine your daughter being married, being named Mary or Jane. So Sheherzad at least has some name recognition. So her name was decided way before I actually had her. And
Wow, what a great
she,
story.
yeah, and then she comes along. And what happened, Jawad, is that when Harvey got cancer, and she was so little, his one thing was that there are so many studies to show that if a parent dies by the time the child is 9 year old, then their psyche is not permanently damaged. So he would say, I have to do everything to somehow survive till she's 9 years old. Because he was a true scientist and
Mm.
believed the studies, and he said it would really help her. And imagine now that from 4 to 8.5, he spent every moment he could with her, making batteries at home, he constructed little labs for her because he was such a scientist. He was doing all these magnetic fields, creating. He took her to Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago twice a day, sometimes every day, teaching her about animals. He was obsessed with language in animals. So that kind of thing. I mean, he spent so much time with her that she had literally him as a single parent for those years because I was doing all the other things.
Mm.
And Avi wanted to be home so much that most of the treatment that I could, I would give him at home. Sometimes, I mean, he would be walking around with IV poles at home. And so many times he was admitted to ICU and in hospital and then come home. Of course, we never took Sheherzad to see him in the hospital, but she grew up seeing him being sick and being treated and somehow accepted it as a norm because she was so young. But
Mm.
then spending all that time with him in such a concentrated way, and once he died, all those memories become etched in your brain. So a normal child may not remember what life was like between 4 and 8.5 years of age with their father because nothing monumental was happening afterwards to make them remember all the things over and over. But they become tattooed on your cerebrum if something like this happens. So when you ask me, does she remember it? Well, since she was born, we had been telling her that her job is to tell stories, her job is to save lives and work for feminist causes. And then spending so much concentrated time with Harvey, doing so many fun things with him also all the time. She remembers so many things that I have forgotten. And let me give you one last story about this and then I'll shut up.
No,
Once
no, no, you're fine.
when she was like 6 or so, Harvey asked her, well, Sheher, what do you want to be when you grow up? Now, remember, Harvey was the head of the cancer center in Chicago at the university. He was a big deal. I mean, he was an internationally recognized oncologist. So he says, what do you want to be when you grow up? And her response was, well, Dad, I don't want to be like you, for sure, because you're too serious. I want to be like my mom. I was feeling very happy about this, very good. I looked at Harvey very triumphantly. But listen to how what she ended this sentence with. She goes, I don't want to be like you, Dad, because you're too serious. I want to be like my mom, a little dumb. I was so
Uh,
shocked by that. But anyway, well, she was too little at the time. When she grew up, of course, we kept telling this story back and forth. So when she was a bit older, I asked her, Sheherzad, what were you thinking of when you said that? I want to be like my mom, a little dumb. You know what her response was? She goes, hey, don't blame me. This is the stereotype I was growing up with. It didn't matter what my storyline is at home, but outside, the stereotype was always dad serious and mom's a little dumb. And so I was just parroting what I was seeing. And that really made an impression on me, Jawad, because no matter how we try to raise our children in the comfort of our nuclear family and cozy little home, we can't protect them from the world outside. They are going to be exposed to whatever stereotypes exist. So, if you really want to change your child, home is not enough. You have to affect the
Yeah.
community. You have to make the change you want to make at home out there. And this became like an important moment for both Sheher and me to realize how important it is that her mission must remain that to change the community and not concentrate so much on yourself, but on what the community is like.
And is she doing that right now? Like,
Absolutely.
how is she doing that? I would love to know.
Well, she is telling stories. And the stories she's telling are about the people who are oppressed, who are the have nots, who are suffering. The films, the short films she's making, everything is about that. Now, during graduate school, um, she had to write the scripts for two feature films. Luckily, Sheherzad has a great and wicked sense of humor also. And for kids growing up in New York City, that is like, I call it heroin chic. It's so edgy. People like me don't even understand the language they're talking in. But the kind of stories of heartbreak that you can tell if you are sensitive to them is what she's doing.
That's
So think
amazing.
about a child whose entry into childhood is through cancer, the C word, which was never mentioned in her presence, but which was present all the time she was growing up, as long as her father was there. And then her entry into adulthood is when her best friend from school, after just graduates from NYU, her best friend Andrew, not her boyfriend, because our Andrew was gay, her best friend gets an inoperable brain cancer and dies. At 22, he gets a brain cancer and dies. And Sheher is there with him every second that she can afford to be, sitting by him, watching him die slowly over 16 months. She has written the chapter number 6 in my book, Andrew,
Okay.
is Sheher writing about Andrew. So she's telling the stories of cancer. Right now, she's making a documentary on cancer, which is telling stories of patients and doctors and all the kinds of things that get involved in the enterprise of cancer. So I would say that how is she doing justice to what she's supposed to do? I haven't been able to do justice to what I am supposed to do. So, how can I expect a young person to actually be making those
Yeah.
decisions? But what I can guarantee you is that she's putting her heart and soul in whatever she's doing. And that for me is enough of a consolation that
100%.
she's
And
doing that.
that is so great. And I think one of the things, I'm just gonna make a little suggestion out there. You know, she's making a documentary on cancer. I think making it more personal from where she's been through and her mom and her dad, that is way more connecting for audiences. I'm just giving you a suggestion as a storyteller. It's her film, but that's something that I would highly recommend if she's, ears to that. But I'll shut up. I'm not trying to say what to
No,
do.
no, that's very, very important advice. As you know, my whole book on cancer is actually full of stories, begins
Yeah,
with stories of patients, and is full of poetry, Urdu
because that,
poetry,
yeah,
a,
yeah.
a
No, I
book
know.
on cancer. And so, yeah, she has a lot of storytelling power in there. Because that is the basis for everything, isn't it? What you
100%.
said is so profound, so profound.
Have you seen the movie Lorenzo's Oil?
No.
I highly recommend that you watch that. It's based on a true story. It's directed by George Miller, who's also a doctor,
Hmm.
who's made films like Mad Max, Babe, and it's basically about this kid. It
Hmm.
stars Susan Sarandon and Nick Nolte. It's about this kid who gets this very rare disease.
Ooh.
And the whole film is about them three, the father, the mother, and the caretaker and the son and how they cope through that. I just, because when you were telling me all this, like as your daughter and your passed away husband yourself, it just sort of connected me to that film, that how it reminded me of that. So I wouldn't say enjoy it, but you would relate to it. It's a very
Yeah,
powerful
yeah,
film.
yeah.
Very
I
powerful
just
film.
saw The Room Next Door, the Almodovar film,
I haven't seen that. I gotta
with
check that out.
Tilda Swinton and Juliana Moore. Excellent. I mean, Almodovar
Yeah.
is
I
who
mean, they're
he
great
is,
actresses. Yeah.
and he's a great director and storyteller. My God, I love that man. But anyway, yeah, I'll see this for sure.
Amazing. Well, I hope this conversation, for me, it was certainly riveting. Obviously,
Oh, I
there'll
want to say
be,
one more thing.
please.
When Sheherzad came to, she was doing some filming at Columbia, and she was filming me in a lab meeting with all
Mm,
my scientists sitting around, and we were talking about, some of the things we talked about today, and especially
sure.
this approach and all. And her, after she filmed it, she shut the camera off and she goes, "Mommy, either this is Nobel Prize material or you are Elizabeth Holmesing us."
She said that in front of everybody?
In front of
Oh,
every,
wow.
only a child can abuse you like this, right? You're
Yeah.
Elizabeth Holmesing. So this is not science fiction. I wanted to end by saying this is not Elizabeth Holmesing. This is not science fiction. This is real. And just I have to make this disclosure that now there is a company, Predict RX, that will be owning this Sentinel. And just wanted to make that disclosure.
Oh,
Not that I
amazing.
have anything to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, it's wonderful. I again, curing cancer is very important, of course, but I think your personal connection to it is what drew me to it to speak to you, because there's a story, and I'm sure there's so many other things that yourself, your Harvey, and your daughter have gone through, but you're still at it, and I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, just the Jew and struggle and life, and that this is what this is all about. It's all about struggling, and if you don't have struggle, life is meaningless.
Suppose, let me end by saying this Emily Dickinson thing. Surgeons must be very careful when they test their knives, for underneath their fine incisions rests the culprit, life. Thank you for a wonderful hour.